When this transfer student walks through the gates of Soyeon Academy, he becomes an instant legend. Girls stop mid-sentence to stare. Boys pretend not to care and fail immediately. Within an hour, 3 different clubs have already tried to recruit him, and a rumor is already spreading that he beat the school's strongest senior in an arm wrestling match without even trying. It's not hard to see why. He's absurdly good-looking, disturbingly calm, and somehow better at everything than everyone else. Faster on the track, sharper in the classroom, and impossibly composed under pressure. When the school bullies corner him behind the gymnasium, certain that a pretty-faced new kid will fold in seconds, he doesn't even raise his voice. He simply steps forward, and 4 grown teenagers are on the ground before the second punch is even thrown. The girls who witness it decide, collectively and instantly, that he is the most romantic thing they've ever seen. None of them know the truth. He is not 18. He has never been 18. Not really. Not since the first time he held a knife with intent. The boy currently charming an entire high school by breaking a delinquent's wrist without spilling his own drink is, in fact, the most feared killer the world has ever produced. Governments have contingency plans in case he ever turns against them. Entire criminal empires keep his photograph in a drawer, not to admire it, but to remind themselves what fear looks like. They call him Vesper. And here's the part that would break the brain of every girl currently swooning over him. Vesper is, biologically, 63 years old. Or he was 3 weeks ago, in a different body, lying in a rented room above a shuttered pawn shop, waiting to die of a lung disease that had already taken his voice down to a whisper and his hands down to a tremor he could no longer hide. He should be dead. By every law of medicine and every law of the world he used to belong to, he should be a corpse in a shallow grave somewhere outside the city, forgotten within a week. Instead, he is standing in a hallway lined with lockers, holding a class schedule, listening to 2 girls whisper about his jawline. 3 weeks earlier, a man named Doha was informed over the phone that he had less than 90 days to live. He didn't flinch. He'd been informed of worse things in worse ways, over a static-filled radio in a jungle, through a note left on a corpse, once by a 12-year-old girl he was supposed to kill, and instead adopted. Death by disease, after everything, felt almost gentle. A mercy, even. He had spent 41 years working for an organization that turned orphan children into weapons, and he had assumed, quietly, that dying of something as mundane as a bad lung was the closest thing to peace a man like him would ever get. He ran a second-hand bookstore by then, his cover for the last decade, a small, dusty shop that smelled like old paper and older regrets. He kept it stocked with everything from pre-war poetry to last year's math textbooks, and he never once raised the price on a book he sold to a kid who clearly couldn't afford it. It was the only soft thing he allowed himself. A man who has killed more people than he can accurately count doesn't get to have hobbies. He gets to have small, quiet penances instead. That was where he met her. A girl walked in on a rainy Tuesday, 17 or so, in a uniform from a school 2 districts over, looking for used textbooks she clearly couldn't pay full price for. She said they were for her younger brother. Doha, without needing to check, already knew she was lying about several things and telling the truth about exactly one, the part about loving someone enough to lie for them. He gave her the books for free, technically damaged goods once he tore the covers, and told her that the only real regret in this life is not being kind to the people you love while you still have the chance. She asked if he had regrets of his own. He said yes, more than she could imagine, and for one unguarded second he thought of a daughter he hadn't spoken to in decades, and the reasons a man chooses a life that makes that kind of silence necessary. Then she pulled a knife and told him, quite calmly, that she'd been sent to kill him. He wasn't surprised. He'd clocked the blade the moment she walked in, clocked the way she moved, the practiced stillness in her shoulders, the scent under her perfume that no soap ever fully removes. He told her he'd let her walk out alive if she told him the truth. Confused that he'd seen through her, she admitted everything. She really did have a younger sibling. She really did need the money. And she really had been sent by an organization that recruited its killers exclusively from orphans it raised itself. An organization that, decades ago, had raised Doha too. He realized, with the particular tiredness of a man watching history repeat itself, that the world he thought he'd left behind hadn't left him. The organization was still doing exactly what it had always done, manufacturing children into blades and handing them targets. Before either of them could decide what came next, the door burst open, and 6 men with guns did the deciding for them. It turned out the girl herself was the bait. Her handlers wanted Do-ha to fight back, to prove the rumors that the retired legend still had teeth, so they could justify the bounty they'd already placed on his head. The exact amount, mockingly, matched every one in his bank account. Someone in charge wanted him dead and his money simultaneously, and had structured the ambush accordingly. He fought. He was 63, dying, and outnumbered, and he still put 3 of them on the ground before his lungs betrayed him and a bullet caught him in the side. He used the confusion to escape through a back exit, dragging his ruined body through an alley in the rain, and collapsed in a children's playground 3 blocks away, certain, almost peacefully certain, that this was where it ended. He thought about the daughter he'd failed. He thought about the 41 years he'd given to an organization that repaid him with a bounty and a bullet the moment his usefulness ran out. He thought, with the strange clarity that comes right before the end, that he had never once had his photograph taken as himself, only under aliases, and that somewhere in his very last thought there was something almost funny about a man who killed for a living never once existing on film as who he really was. Then everything went black, and then, impossibly, it didn't stay that way. He woke up in the same playground hours later, rain-soaked, and the first thing he noticed was that the pain was gone, not lessened, gone. He sat up expecting agony, and found none. He touched his side where the bullet had gone in and found unbroken skin. He touched his face and found it smooth, unlined, unfamiliar under his own fingers. He found a puddle and looked down into it, and a boy of maybe 18 looked back up at him. His first coherent thought was not fear, it was calculation, the same cold, immediate assessment that had kept him alive for 4 decades. He flexed his hands, faster than before. He tested his knee, the one that had ached with arthritis for 15 years. Silent, painless. Whatever had happened to him, it hadn't just spared his life. It had rebuilt it from the ground up, stripped every year of decay off his body, and left him standing in the shell of the young man he used to be, before the world made him into what he became. He didn't understand it. He still doesn't. But understanding wasn't the priority. The priority, the only priority that had ever mattered in his life, arrived almost instantly, and with total clarity. Nobody in the organization would recognize this face. Nobody would connect this 18-year-old stranger to the dying old man they'd just tried to erase. For the first time in 41 years, Do-ha was invisible. He spent that first night in a public restroom, staring at a face he hadn't worn since before most of his crimes were committed, while 2 businessmen argued loudly in the next stall about an advertising contract worth $80 million and a factory worker's mother who couldn't afford chemotherapy. One of them bragged about buying luxury watches with the money he'd extorted from a teenager desperate enough to sign anything. Do-ha listened, said nothing, and when the men finally noticed him and shoved him for lingering too long, he calmly walked out, then walked back in, closed the door, and gave both of them a very thorough, very educational lesson in consequences. It cost him nothing, and it felt, for the first time in years, like doing something purely because it was right, rather than because it was ordered. Afterward, standing outside in his new borrowed clothes, he allowed himself exactly 1 moment of grief for the life he'd just lost, the bookstore, the girl who'd tried to kill him and then hadn't, the small, dusty penance he'd built for himself, and then he closed the door on it, the way he'd closed doors on every version of himself before this one. The organization that raised him, betrayed him, and tried to erase him has a name whispered in back rooms and boardrooms across 3 continents: the Hollow Court. What began 60 years ago as a single church-run orphanage for war orphans has metastasized into a global machine that manufactures killers the way other companies manufacture cars, efficiently, ruthlessly, and always in service of whoever currently sits at the top. Do-ha knows the Hollow Court's history better than its current leadership does, because he lived most of it. He knows that its founder, a quiet, half-mad priest everyone called Father, genuinely believed he was saving abandoned children by giving them purpose, even if that purpose was violence. He knows that the man currently running the court, a cold, calculating figure known only as the Regent, was not the founder's blood, but his adopted son, and that the Regent seized control the moment the old priest tried to retire his most dangerous creations rather than keep weaponizing them. Doha was one of those creations. He was, in fact, the very first, the original prototype the entire killer training doctrine was built around, back when the orphanage was still small enough that the founder knew every child's name. He completed the organization's most brutal survival trial, a month alone in wilderness with a single bullet and no guarantee of rescue, in a record time nobody has matched since. He went on to serve for over 4 decades, becoming quietly, terrifyingly legendary, not because he sought fame, but because everyone who might have witnessed his skill firsthand rarely lived long enough to describe it. The people who do know his reputation call him, when they dare speak of him at all, the Undertaker's Undertaker, the killer other killers were sent to eliminate and never returned from. Now he is 18 years old, broke, homeless, and functionally a ghost with no papers, no history, and no way to access the small fortune the court just tried to steal from him. And the first thing he decides, standing in the rain, outside a public restroom with wet hair and a stolen jacket, is that he is going to walk straight back into the organization that murdered him and take it apart from the inside. He knows he can't do it alone. Even at his considerable best, dismantling a global criminal syndicate single-handedly is the kind of plan that gets men killed twice. He needs eyes inside, resources, and, though he'd never phrase it this sentimentally, people. He thinks unexpectedly of the girl from the bookstore, the one who'd been sent to kill him and instead ended up owing him her life. If she's smart, and she is, she'll already suspect that the stranger currently wearing a teenager's face used to be someone much older. He finds her that same week in a part of the city polite people don't walk through after dark, a converted basement club that caters exclusively to a very particular, very illegal clientele, run by a blind woman who can apparently smell a killer's bloodstains through cologne. The girl, whose real name he already knows is Han Sua, doesn't recognize him. Why would she? The face is completely different. But something about the way he moves, the way he reads the room before he's finished walking into it, makes her hand drift instinctively toward a hidden blade. He tells her exactly who he is. She doesn't believe him, not until he recites, word for word, the conversation they had in the bookstore 3 weeks ago, a conversation only the two of them and the men who shot him could possibly know about. She goes very pale, very quickly. "You're insane," she tells him, once she's stopped staring. "You want to walk back into the hollow court. As what? A spy? They only recruit from the orphanage. You're not from the orphanage. You'd have to be a stranger they somehow decide to make an exception for, and the court doesn't make exceptions." "There's one exception," Doha says. "There's always one path in for outsiders who prove themselves impossible to ignore." She already knows what he means before he finishes the sentence, and she already hates the idea. The Hollow Court runs a front operation disguised as an elite preparatory school, Seoyeon Academy, glossy and prestigious on the surface, home to award ceremonies and honor rolls and dance competitions, and underneath all of it, a secret training track that quietly funnels a handful of chosen students into the court's next generation of killers. Normally, admission to that track requires court orphanage lineage, but there is, buried in decades-old founding bylaws that nobody in current leadership has bothered to update, a single clause allowing a non-orphanage student to earn entry, if they make themselves too remarkable for the school to ignore. "You want to become a rumor," Sua says slowly, understanding despite herself. "Loud enough that they have to let you in just to keep an eye on you." "I want to become the last thing they ever underestimate," Doha says. She calls the plan reckless, insane, and almost certainly suicidal, 3 separate times, in 3 separate sentences. But she also remembers, vividly, kneeling in a burned-out room 3 weeks ago while men with guns closed in, and a man she'd been sent to kill choosing, instead, to save her. She remembers a hospital bed years earlier and a doctor who refused to treat her adopted brother because his survival wasn't cost-effective, and how she'd sworn on that day that she would tear the world apart before she let someone she loved die because they weren't profitable enough to save. She recognizes something in Doha's plan that she recognizes in herself. Not recklessness, certainty. "Fine," she says finally. "But if you die pretending to be a teenager, I'm not attending the funeral." "Fair," Doha says, and for the first time since waking up in that rain-soaked playground, something that might, in another life, have been a smile, threatens the corner of his mouth. He walks into Seoyeon Academy 3 days later as a transfer student named Kang Ha-eul, a name he invents on the spot, borrowed loosely from a boy who died protecting him during a mission decades ago, the kind of quiet tribute nobody else will ever notice or understand. Within his first hour, he outruns the school's fastest sprinter without breaking a sweat, dismantles a would-be bully squad without spilling a cup of water balanced on a nearby table, and casually reveals, to a stunned assembly hall full of students during introductions, that his hobby is fighting and his specialty is killing people, delivered with such deadpan comic timing that half the auditorium laughs and the other half starts quietly making plans to recruit him. By lunchtime, he's already the single most talked about student in Seoyeon Academy's history, exactly as intended. What he doesn't yet know is that the Hollow Court's current leadership has grown paranoid in recent months, convinced that a threat is circling them from somewhere unseen. A threat the Regent's inner circle has started calling, in increasingly nervous whispers, the Ghost. What he also doesn't know is that his own name, his real one, the one he buried under decades of aliases, still means something to exactly one person left inside the organization, a scarred, silent instructor everyone calls Sergeant Bake, who runs the school's hidden killer training program, and who, the moment he lays eyes on the strange new transfer student's fighting stance, feels an impossible, hair-raising recognition he cannot yet explain. And somewhere above them all, in a private office lined with portraits of orphanage children long dead, the Regent receives a single, encrypted message from a low-level operative. A photograph of a striking new transfer student at Seoyeon Academy, attached with a note that reads simply, "He fights like someone we used to know." The Regent stares at the photograph for a long time. Then he sets it down, very carefully, and asks his assistant to pull every file the court has on a man they buried 3 weeks ago. The problem, Ha-eul quickly discovers, is that being famous is easy. Being recruited is a different matter entirely. He spends his first week at Seoyeon Academy doing exactly what a man with 63 years of tactical experience packed into an 18-year-old body would do, he observes. He learns the layout of the school twice as fast as anyone should be able to, memorizes faculty schedules, notices which hallways go suspiciously unmonitored by cameras, and clocks, within 3 days, that the school's volunteer club, an unremarkable-looking after-school activity that meets in a converted gymnasium annex, has exactly 0 actual volunteer work associated with it and an unusually high number of students who move like they've been in real fights. He also learns that admission to the volunteer club is restricted, almost exclusively, to students from a specific feeder institution, the Wonggok Home, a state-registered orphanage that everyone at Seoyeon treats with a strange, unspoken reverence. Students from Wonggok get quiet nods in the hallway from teachers. They get excused from certain classes without explanation. And they all, without exception, carry themselves with the particular stillness of people who have been taught, very young, exactly how much force it takes to break a human wrist. Ha-eul knows that stillness. He used to have it himself, once, before 4 decades of experience turned stillness into something closer to silence. He also knows the rulebook loophole Suah described, the old founding clause allowing a non-Wonggok student entry if they prove themselves too remarkable to overlook, and he knows that clause is about to be tested, because the school's biggest showcase event of the semester, the Seoyeon Sports and Arts Festival, is exactly 4 days away. He treats it the way he'd treat a mission briefing. At the festival, he doesn't merely win the 200-meter sprint, he wins it by a margin so absurd that the school's reigning track star, a third year with a real shot at the national team, simply stops running halfway through and stands on the field laughing in disbelief, while the rest of the school loses its collective mind. During the vision screening booth, a promotional gimmick meant to advertise a new optometry sponsor, Ha-eul reads letters from a distance the equipment's designer apparently never anticipated a human being needing to read from, prompting a nearby student to loudly ask if he's secretly an alien. In the culinary elective's fruit carving demonstration, he produces, in 90 seconds, a technically flawless rabbit carved from a single apple, while the rest of the class produces something closer to abstract art. The instructor stares at the finished piece for a long moment before quietly writing something in a small notebook he does not show anyone. By the end of the festival, the transfer student has become the only topic of conversation in 3 separate group chats, one anonymous school gossip account, and, though Ha-il doesn't yet know it, one encrypted internal memo circulating quietly through the Hollow Court's regional command structure. The real turning point comes 2 days later, in a stairwell nobody uses, where a cluster of upperclassmen have cornered a mild, soft-spoken homeroom teacher named Mr. Yun. They're pushing him around for the crime of assigning detention, threatening, with the particular cruelty only bored, well-connected teenagers can manage, to fabricate an abuse complaint against him if he doesn't back off. One of them shoves the man to the floor. Another suggests, laughing, that they film it for views. Ha-il steps into the stairwell holding a coffee he never gets to drink. He doesn't shout, he doesn't posture. He simply asks, in a tone of mild curiosity, whether they were just about to apologize to their teacher, and when the group's biggest member responds by swinging at him, Ha-il redirects the punch with the kind of economy of motion that takes most fighters decades to develop, drops the boy with a single strike, and, when a second attacker hurls a loose brick from a nearby construction bin, catches it out of the air and crushes it into gravel with one hand, never once spilling the coffee in his other. The remaining bullies don't apologize. They run. Mr. Yun, still sitting on the floor, stares up at Ha-il with an expression that isn't quite gratitude and isn't quite fear. It's recognition. The specific kind that comes from someone who has spent years around people trained to fight and knows, instantly, that what he just witnessed wasn't ordinary talent. He notices, too, that not a drop spilled from the coffee cup during the entire exchange, and that detail seems to unsettle him more than the violence did. "You're not just a transfer student," Mr. Yun says quietly, once they're alone. "No," Ha-il agrees. "I've been watching you for a week," the teacher admits. "So has someone else. Someone who runs a club you've been trying very hard to get invited into." That's how Ha-il learns that Mr. Yun isn't merely a homeroom teacher. He's Hollow Court personnel, specifically, a talent scout, tasked with identifying exactly the kind of anomaly Ha-il has spent a week manufacturing. And that afternoon, for the first time, Ha-il is formally welcomed into the volunteer club. Not as a favor, not as an accident, but as a calculated recruitment by an organization that has just decided he's worth the risk of an exception. The volunteer club, once you're past the deliberately boring front door, is a different world entirely. Formally, it's called the Falcon Division, So-Yun Academy's hidden killer training track, operating under the supervision of a scarred, silent instructor everyone refers to only as Sergeant Beck. Officially, Falcon Division students take extra physical training and community outreach electives. Unofficially, they are being groomed, one semester at a time, to become the Hollow Court's next generation of professional killers. Ha-il walks in expecting an obviously dangerous environment, and instead finds something almost mundane. Students doing calisthenics, reviewing case files, practicing knife maintenance with the same bored diligence other teenagers reserve for math homework. It's the ordinariness that unsettles him most. He has seen, in his previous life, exactly how an organization turns children into weapons, and he recognizes, immediately, that the process works precisely because it looks this unremarkable from the inside. 2 students in particular catch his attention on his first day. A pair of brothers, both enormous, both loud, both clearly the physical powerhouses of their cohort. The older one, Baram, specializes in bursts of overwhelming speed. The younger, Woojin, is built like a small mountain and hits like one too. Both are Wonggok orphans, both are aggressively proud of it, and both take one look at the new nepotism transfer and decide, instantly, that a welcoming beatdown is in order. "You don't belong here," Baram informs him, cracking his knuckles with theatrical menace. "This isn't some delinquent punching side quest. We've spent 18 years earning our spot. You showed up wearing a fancy uniform and somehow talked your way in." Ha-il, privately amused by the idea that 18 years is a long time to earn anything, allows the brothers precisely 3 attacks each, enough to let them feel like they're testing him, not enough to actually let either of them land a hit, before sidestepping the entire exchange and walking away without breaking a sweat. Watching from the sidelines, Sua, who is quietly enrolled in Falcon Division herself weeks earlier, ostensibly as a low-ranked trainee, actually as Ha-il's inside contact, has to physically restrain herself from laughing at the brothers' baffled outrage. The real test, however, comes 4 days later, when Sergeant Bake announces that the division has received its first genuine field commission, a paying client, a major industrial conglomerate called the Eseal Group, has requested Falcon Division's assistance recovering the chairman's teenage son, who vanished 11 days ago during what should have been a routine visit to an amusement park. The chairman, Sergeant Beck explains flatly, wants the boy recovered, and wants whoever took him personally punished, which is precisely the sort of quiet revenge arrangement organizations like the Hollow Court specialize in providing. Whichever team successfully completes this commission, Beck adds, will be personally recommended for early promotion to full operative status. Normally that recommendation takes another 2 years to earn, with quote. The room goes very quiet. Even the loudest students in Falcon Division understand what's being offered. A shortcut through years of grueling probation, handed out for a single successful mission. Baram and Woojin volunteer immediately, dragging along a handful of the class's other Wongok students. Suah raises her hand next, and when Ha'il raises his a half-second later, Suah shoots him a look that says, quite clearly, stop copying me. My hand's been up the whole time, he replies, entirely straight-faced. You just weren't watching closely enough. The mission site turns out to be Wandoland, a sprawling amusement park on the edge of the city, the last confirmed location of the missing boy, Choi Yul, before his tracker signal went dark. The team arrives with almost nothing to go on. No ransom note, no confirmed sighting, no evidence the boy is even still alive. What they do have is Ha'il's growing, uneasy certainty that something about the case doesn't add up. Wongok-trained operatives don't usually take this long to locate a single missing teenager in a public park this size, which means either their target is being deliberately hidden by someone who knows exactly how tracking countermeasures work, or the missing boy was never really the point of this mission at all. He keeps that suspicion to himself for now, mostly because he doesn't yet have enough to act on it, and because the Choi brothers, as everyone has taken to calling Baram and Woojin, have already abandoned any pretense of investigative discipline in favor of riding every roller coaster in the park twice. It's Suah, eventually, who finds the first real lead, the missing boy's wireless earbuds, still transmitting a faint signal, traced to the women's restroom near the park's haunted house attraction. What should be a quiet, careful investigation nearly turns into an unnecessary brawl when a jealous, oblivious teenage boyfriend mistakes her questioning for harassment of his girlfriend, and Suah, mildly annoyed, lollipop still in her mouth, ends up disarming and subduing him in under 10 seconds without ever losing her composure or, notably, her candy. The trail leads the team to the haunted house itself, fully booked according to the reservation system, and yet, according to staff records, not a single guest has actually entered all day. Ha'il recognizes the pattern immediately. An amusement park's worth of ambient screaming makes the perfect cover for an actual abduction site. Hidden in plain sight behind a sold-out sign, nobody bothers to question. The team walks in, the doors close behind them, and within seconds, Ha'il feels the specific, prickling wrongness of a space that should be full of hidden threats, and instead contains no discernible presence at all. The sensation of a trap so well constructed that even its bait can't sense the hand pulling the strings. Something's wrong, he says quietly, just before all 6 of them are gassed unconscious by chloroform pumped invisibly through the haunted house's fog machines. They wake up bound, gagged, and arranged neatly in a converted maintenance room by a man who introduces himself, with theatrical politeness, as Crow, a former Hollow Court operative expelled years ago for excessive brutality even by the court's forgiving standards. Crow explains, almost cheerfully, that the missing heir was never really the objective. The Eseal Group's chairman burned a bridge with the Hollow Court's leadership years ago by refusing to pay an insurance premium the organization tried to extort from every major conglomerate in the country. This, the kidnapping, the staged commission, the trap disguised as a rescue mission, is Crow's way of collecting the debt personally, using a batch of Green Falcon Division recruits as convenient, disposable proof of what happens to people who don't pay. The Choi brothers, predictably, respond to being threatened by declaring, loudly and simultaneously, that Crow will regret this. Crow, in turn, proposes a game. If the brothers can defeat him in single combat, he'll release the missing boy and let everyone walk away unharmed. If they lose, each of them forfeits a leg. They accept before Ha'il can stop them. What follows is not a fight so much as an education in humiliation. Crow's weapon, a Nepalese-style kukri he spent decades mastering, turns out to be heavier and faster than either brother anticipated, and his technique, developed specifically to counter overwhelming strength, punishes their aggression at every turn. Within minutes, both Baram and Woojin are bleeding on the ground, and Crow, entirely unbothered, turns his attention toward the remaining, apparently weaker targets, Ha-Il and Sua. "Double the stakes," Ha-Il says calmly, before Crow can even finish gloating. "Both my legs, one arm, or my head, if that's more entertaining for you." Crow, delighted by the audacity, agrees, and throws Ha-Il a blade to make the exchange, as he puts it, fair. Ha-Il ignores it entirely, instead picking up a large metal serving tray from a nearby supply shelf, prompting Crow to laugh so hard he nearly drops his weapon. "A tray," Crow manages, wiping his eyes. "You're going to block a kukri with a tray." He swings, expecting the confrontation to end in a single strike. The tray splits cleanly in two. What Crow doesn't realize, what he only understands several exchanges too late, is that the split was never an accident Ha-Il was trying to prevent. It was the entire plan. Two razor-edged half-shields, forged in real time from Crow's own attack, are exactly the weapons Ha-Il intended to end up holding. From that point, the fight inverts entirely. Every strike Crow throws, certain he's finally landed the killing blow, instead finds a pillow, a discarded jacket, empty air, while Ha-Il, moving with a precision Crow has never encountered in an opponent this young, methodically dismantles the muscles and nerves in Crow's sword arm one surgical strike at a time, until the man's grip finally fails and his weapon clatters uselessly to the floor. "How?" Crow demands, staring at his own unresponsive hand. "Does an 18-year-old know nerve anatomy well enough to do that?" "I've had a very unusual education," Ha-Il says. Cornered and desperate, Crow reaches for a final option. A live grenade, meant to level the entire room and take everyone in it, hostages included, down with him. He doesn't get the chance to pull the pin. Ha-Il closes the distance before Crow's fingers finish moving, forces the grenade into the man's own mouth with an eerie, almost gentle efficiency, and calmly instructs him to bite down hard if he'd like to keep breathing. A piece of advice Crow, weeping quietly around live ordnance, follows without argument. By the time the rest of the team regains consciousness, the fight is already over. The missing heir is found alive in a nearby storage crate, and Crow is thoroughly, comprehensively subdued, still babbling promises to never cross the ECL group again as he's zipped into a body bag for transport back to Hollow Court headquarters. The commission is a resounding success. The Choi brothers, despite losing their individual duel spectacularly, still receive full credit for the mission and are formally promoted to junior operative status, disappointed, loudly, that their rank badge reads only the lowest tier, despite defeating a target they insist was basically an apostle-level threat. Ha-Il, watching them argue about their rank over lunch an hour later, privately reflects that he hasn't laughed, genuinely laughed, in longer than he can remember, and finds the sensation almost as unfamiliar as his new body. What none of them know yet, what Ha-Il himself won't discover until several days later, standing in a private office aboard a private jet belonging to a grateful and deeply curious ACL group chairman, is that the man they just rescued a kidnapped heir's father from owing a debt to is about to recognize something in Ha-Il's face that no one alive should be able to recognize. Because Chairman Jang of the ECL group is old enough to remember a night 40 years ago when a masked operative single-handedly boarded a hijacked train, walked through 6 armed hostiles without wasting a single bullet, and pulled a terrified 17-year-old hostage out alive. A hostage who grew up to inherit one of the largest conglomerates in the country, and who has never once forgotten the face of the man who saved him. A face that, impossibly, looks exactly like the boy currently sitting across from him at dinner, decades younger than it should be. Chairman Jang doesn't say anything for a long moment. He simply sits across the table, wine glass forgotten in his hand, staring at Ha-Il with the expression of a man trying to convince himself he isn't losing his mind. "You're going to think I'm being ridiculous," he says finally, "but I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly, because I have spent 40 years wondering about the answer." "Ask," Ha-Il says. "December, 41 years ago. A train, a hijacking that never made the news, because certain governments made very sure it wouldn't. Jang's hand tightens slightly around the glass. There was a man on that train. He never told me his name. He killed 6 people to get to me and didn't waste a single bullet doing it. When it was over, he put his hand on my head and told me to get up, because we had a long way home. Ha-Hail says nothing. He doesn't need to. His silence is answer enough, and Jang, watching his face, seems to understand that immediately. You have his eyes, Jang says quietly. I've thought about that man's face for 40 years, and I would know it anywhere, in any body. You're not his son. I'd have heard if he had a son. So either this is the strangest coincidence in human history, or you're about to tell me something I'm not going to believe. Ha-Il considers, for a moment, exactly how much to give away. He decides, in the end, that a man who has spent 4 decades keeping a decades-old debt of gratitude alive has earned at least a partial truth. I can't explain how, he says, but I'm the same person who was on that train. Jang doesn't laugh. He doesn't call security either. He simply sits back in his chair, exhales slowly, and after a long silence says, "Then I suppose I owe you considerably more than a dinner." He offers resources, money, false documentation, private transportation, anything Ha-Il needs to move through the world without the scrutiny an ordinary 18-year-old would attract. Ha-Il turns down almost all of it. A man who spent 40 years learning to disappear doesn't suddenly need a benefactor's paper trail attached to him. But he accepts one thing, a standing invitation, and a private, untraceable phone line that connects directly to Jang himself. No assistance, no records. If the day comes that you need something only I can provide, Jang says, call this number. I don't care what it costs me. It's a small thing, but in a life built almost entirely out of transactions, it's the first purely unconditional offer Ha-Il has received in longer than he can remember, and it unsettles him more than the fight with Crow did. Back at Seoyeon Academy, the successful commission changes the temperature of Falcon Division almost overnight. The Choi brothers strut through the hallways like conquering heroes, showing their new operative badges to anyone who'll look, and several people who won't. Sua, typically unimpressed by most things, allows herself exactly one small, private smile when nobody's watching. And Ha-Il, watching all of it, feels the mission's success settle over him with a satisfaction that has nothing to do with the Hollow Court's approval and everything to do with the fact that he chose to save that boy, not because he was ordered to, but because it was right. That satisfaction doesn't last. 3 days later, Falcon Division receives a routine administrative notice. Every newly promoted operative, as part of standard onboarding, is required to complete a full biometric screening at the court's regional medical facility, a sprawling, unremarkable-looking hospital called Seoyeon General, which, like everything else connected to the Hollow Court, wears its ordinary face like a mask. Ha-Il understands the danger immediately. His fingerprints have changed. His face has changed. His entire physical body is, for all practical purposes, a stranger's. But blood carries deeper signatures than skin does, and if the court's database still holds even a fragment of his original genetic profile from 4 decades of service, and organizations like the Hollow Court never, ever delete anything, then a routine blood draw could be the single fastest way to expose him. He can't skip the screening without drawing exactly the kind of attention he's spent weeks avoiding, so he goes, calculating the odds as he walks through the hospital's front doors, and privately deciding that if the DNA match does surface, he'll simply have to make sure nobody who sees the results lives long enough to report it. It doesn't come to that, not immediately. The blood draw happens without incident, processed by an overworked nurse who has clearly done this 100 times today and doesn't spare Ha-Il a second glance. But walking the corridors afterward, waiting for results that could end everything, he starts noticing details that don't belong in an ordinary hospital. Doors that require keycard access 3 levels beyond what any legitimate ward would need, staff who move with a stillness he recognizes instantly as combat training rather than medical discipline, and, on the building's directory, a wing labeled simply Research, Restricted, with no further explanation offered to anyone without sufficient clearance. He also notices the man running the hospital. Officially, Dr. Il-Hwan So is Seoyeon General's chief administrator, a soft-spoken, immaculately dressed physician, beloved by patients and staff alike for his warmth and his tireless personal attention to difficult cases. Unofficially, Whispered about only by the handful of court operatives who know the hospital's true function, Dr. Seo holds a much older, much darker title. He is one of the Hollow Court's 12 founding operatives, the legendary killers who built the organization's reputation before most of Falcon Division's current students were even born. They call him, when they dare call him anything at all, the Gardener, because of his obsession, decades in the making, with what he calls cultivating the next stage of human evolution through pain, trauma, and a self-administered regimen of experimental compounds that have, over the years, turned his own body into something no longer entirely human. Ha-il doesn't know any of this yet. What he knows, standing in a hospital corridor holding a discharge slip, is that the same soft-spoken doctor who personally greeted every new Falcon Division recruit today has just looked directly at him for slightly too long, with an expression far too calculating for a man simply reviewing intake paperwork. The gardener has noticed him, and 3 floors below, in a laboratory that doesn't appear on any hospital blueprint, a technician quietly flags an anomaly in the day's blood samples, a genetic signature that partially, impossibly, matches a profile on file for an operative the organization officially recorded as deceased weeks ago. The technician doesn't understand what he's looking at. He assumes, reasonably, that it's a data error, a contaminated sample, a lab mistake waiting to be quietly corrected. He forwards the flag up the chain anyway, because that's protocol, and protocol doesn't care about reasonable assumptions. The message reaches Dr. Seo's desk within the hour. He reads it twice, then he sets it down, very carefully, next to a folder he's kept for 3 weeks. Ever since a strange internal memo first crossed his desk, describing an unusually gifted transfer student who'd talked his way into Falcon Division through a rules loophole nobody had exploited in over a decade. The gardener smiles, slowly, the particular smile of a man who has just been handed something rarer than gold. "Bring the boy back in," he tells his assistant. "Tell him it's a follow-up screening. Tell him I'd like to meet him personally this time." Ha-il receives the summons 2 days later, delivered through Sergeant Bake with the casual authority of routine administrative business. He agrees to attend because refusing would be far more suspicious than complying, and because some part of him, the part that has spent 4 decades reading danger before it fully announces itself, already suspects that whatever waits for him at Soyeon General isn't a routine follow-up at all. He calls Sua before he leaves. "If I don't check in by tonight," he says, "assume the worst and don't come looking for me alone." "That's not remotely reassuring," she says. "It's not meant to be reassuring. It's meant to be accurate." She's quiet for a moment. Then, with the particular bluntness that has come to define most of their conversations, she says, "You know I'm coming looking for you anyway." He doesn't argue. He's learned, in the short time he's known her, that arguing with Han Sua about her own decisions is a spectacularly inefficient use of anyone's time. The hospital, when he arrives, feels different from his first visit. Quieter in a way that isn't natural, the specific hush of a building where something is being deliberately hidden rather than simply calm. Dr. Seo greets him personally at the reception desk, warmer and more attentive than any hospital administrator has any reason to be toward a single new patient, and walks him, unhurried, toward an elevator that requires a keycard Ha-il has never seen before. "I like to give new Falcon Division talent a personal tour," Dr. Seo explains pleasantly, as the elevator begins descending well past what the building's exterior should structurally allow. "Most of what happens in this hospital, the students never see. I find that a shame. Don't you think potential deserves proper recognition?" Ha-il says nothing, watching the floor numbers tick downward into negative digits the elevator panel technically shouldn't have. The doors open onto a corridor lined with reinforced glass, and behind that glass, in chamber after chamber of glowing liquid, are shapes that were once human and are, quite clearly, no longer entirely so. "Welcome," Dr. Seo says, spreading his arms with the pride of a man unveiling his life's finest work, to where evolution actually happens. Ha-il's expression doesn't change. Internally, every instinct he's spent 41 years honing is screaming the same single urgent conclusion. This was never a blood test. This was an invitation. And somewhere behind him, the elevator doors slide shut, sealing with a soft, final click that sounds, in the silence of that corridor, exactly like a trap closing. The chamber stretches farther than the hospital's exterior should allow, rows of glass tanks receding into shadow, each one holding something that used to have a name. Ha-il counts 12 before he stops counting, because counting isn't useful right now. Cataloging exits is. There's exactly one. The elevator. Sealed. A ventilation shaft 11 meters up, too narrow for an adult body to move through quickly, and Dr. Seo, standing between him and both. You're wondering why I showed you this, the gardener says, walking slowly along the row of tanks like a man strolling through a garden he's genuinely proud of. Most students, I keep in the dark, literally. It's kinder, in a way. They never have to know what waits for them if they fail to be exceptional. But you're not most students, are you, Ha-il? You tell me, Ha-il says. I've been doing this a long time. Dr. Seo taps the glass of the nearest tank, and the shape inside twitches, faintly, in response. 30 years, give or take. I've watched a lot of gifted young people walk through this hospital. Most of them are gifted the way a good racehorse is gifted. Fast, strong, bred for a single purpose. You're different. You move like someone who has already lived an entire life learning what not to do in a fight. I find that fascinating. I'd like to know where that came from. Curiosity killed the doctor, Ha-il says. Dr. Seo laughs. A genuine, delighted sound that echoes strangely against the glass. I like you. That's rare too. Most people who end up in this room don't have a sense of humor left by the time they get here. He gestures, almost lazily, and the lighting shifts. Not dimming, but reconfiguring. Panels sliding to reveal a wider space Ha-il hadn't registered. A converted surgical theater with restraint tables and equipment that has no legitimate medical function Ha-il can identify. I've dedicated my life to a very simple idea, Dr. Seko continues. Evolution isn't an accident. It's a decision. Nature is slow and wasteful and sentimental. I'm neither. I take what's strong, I strip away everything soft that holds it back, and I build something better. You, Kang Ha-il, or whoever you actually are underneath that name, you have the raw material. I'd like to help you become what you're clearly capable of becoming. And if I say no, Dr. Seo's smile doesn't waver. Then I'll be very disappointed, and you'll join my collection anyway. I'd simply prefer you volunteer. The first attack comes without warning. Not from Dr. Seo directly, but from the ceiling, where two of his lab technicians, who Ha-il had dismissed as harmless support staff, drop down with the coordinated precision of trained operatives. Syringes already primed. Ha-il takes the first one down before his feet fully leave the ground, driving an elbow into the man's throat hard enough to end the conversation permanently. The second manages one wild swing before Ha-il redirects the syringe into his own neck, and the sedative meant for Ha-il puts the technician on the floor instead. Dr. Seo watches the entire exchange with the mild, appreciative interest of a man watching a promising student ace an exam. Beautiful, he says. Truly, but you should know, I didn't bring you down here to test your combat skill. I already know it's exceptional. I brought you down here because I wanted you to see what happens to exceptional people who refuse me. He moves. Ha-il has fought fast opponents before. He has fought strong opponents, skilled opponents, opponents with decades of specialized training behind every strike. He has never, in 41 years of professional violence, felt what it's like to be hit by something that isn't entirely bound by ordinary human limits. Until Dr. Seo's fist connects with his raised guard, and the impact throws him 15 feet backward into a bank of monitoring equipment hard enough to shatter 3 screens. He gets up. His arm is numb from the elbow down. That, Dr. Seo says, almost gently, is what 30 years of self-directed evolution buys you. Every injury I've ever survived made me stronger. Every limit my body tried to enforce, I've since removed. I'm not entirely human anymore, Ha-il. I stopped being satisfied with human a long time ago. Ha-il, flexing feeling back into his fingers, allows himself one brief, private thought. This is going to take longer than I planned for. Then he does what 4 decades of survival have trained him to do better than almost anyone alive. He starts looking for the thing Dr. Seo doesn't know he's revealing. Every fighter has a tell buried somewhere in their strength. Dr. Seo's arrives 3 exchanges later, disguised as an advantage. His punches are landing harder each time, the visible tissue at his knuckles swelling and reddening and healing almost as fast as it tears. Not slowing him down, feeding him. Ha-il catches the pattern and files it away, absorbing 2 more brutal hits. Deliberately, calculated pain in exchange for data, while he confirms what he suspects. The gardener's power isn't limitless. It's cyclical. Damage in, greater strength out, in a loop that has no natural ceiling Ha-il can find. Which means, somewhere, there has to be a cost the man hasn't accounted for. "You're staring," Dr. Seo observes, delighted. "Trying to solve me. I admire that. Most people just scream." "Your muscles are outgrowing your skeleton," Ha-il says. The gardener's smile falters for the first time. "Every cycle, the tissue expands faster than your bone density can compensate," Ha-il continues, circling, buying time, watching the tiny hitch that's crept into the doctor's left shoulder over the last several exchanges. A hitch that wasn't there when the fight started. "You've been so focused on how much pain makes you stronger, you never bothered checking whether your own frame can keep holding the result. You're not evolving, you're compressing yourself into your own body until something gives." "That's absurd," Dr. Seo says, and swings again. A killing blow, full force, the kind of strike that has ended every previous fight in this room in under 4 seconds. It doesn't land. Not because Ha-il dodges it, he doesn't, not entirely, but because the gardener's own shoulder locks mid-swing, tendon and bone finally reaching the threshold Ha-il just described. The joint seizing so violently that Dr. Seo drops to one knee with a sound that isn't quite a scream and isn't quite anything human either. "You've been so busy proving you can survive anything," Ha-il says, standing over him. "You never noticed you built yourself a cage." He doesn't finish it there. Killing the gardener, satisfying as the option is, means losing every piece of intelligence the man carries about the court's inner workings, the regent's location, and whatever this laboratory has been building toward for 30 years. Instead, Ha-il does something considerably more useful. He disables him, methodically and thoroughly, leaving Dr. Seo alive, immobile, and, for possibly the first time in 3 decades, genuinely afraid. "How," the gardener manages, through gritted teeth, "does an 18-year-old diagnose a physiological collapse in the middle of a fight?" "I've had a very unusual education," Ha-il says again, and this time, there's something almost tired in the way he says it. He doesn't get the chance to interrogate him properly. The lab's alarm system, triggered automatically by the disabling of 2 technicians and the sudden biometric crash of its chief researcher, floods the facility with security personnel within 90 seconds. Not Hollow Court operatives, but a private mercenary unit Dr. Seo apparently keeps on retainer specifically for scenarios exactly like this one. 20 armed professionals converge on the lower laboratory level with the coordinated efficiency of people who train for containment breaches regularly. Ha-il, already exhausted from the fight with Dr. Seo, does the math instantly. 20 armed professionals in a confined space is not a fight he wants to have, while also protecting an unconscious, injured gardener he still needs alive for information. He makes a decision he doesn't love but understands is correct. He leaves Dr. Seo where he is, memorizes the layout of the restricted research wing as thoroughly as he can in the seconds available, and goes looking for the one thing that might actually get him out of a sealed underground facility crawling with hostiles. The elevator override he glimpsed on a control panel during the fight, tucked behind a bank of monitors he's fairly sure nobody's had reason to check in years. He's 3 steps from it when the lights cut entirely. Not a power failure. Ha-il knows the difference instantly. This is deliberate, surgical, every light in the corridor extinguished within the same half-second, plunging 20 armed mercenaries and 1 exhausted killer into total darkness simultaneously. Someone else is in the building. A voice, young, female, entirely calm, cuts through the darkness and the sudden confused shouting of the mercenary team. "You could have just told me you were in trouble," Sua says, somewhere close, though Ha-il can't pinpoint exactly where. "Instead, I get a phone call telling me not to come looking for you, which, by the way, is the single most obvious way to guarantee I show up anyway." "I told you not to come alone?" Ha-il says into the dark. "I'm not alone," Sua says, and there's something in her voice, a satisfaction she's clearly been saving up to deliver, that makes Ha-il go very still, because he already suspects what's coming next. The mercenary team's confused shouting turns, within seconds, into screaming. When the backup lighting finally flickers back on, Ha-il finds 19 of the 20 mercenaries unconscious or disabled on the floor, disarmed with a precision that suggests whoever did it wasn't remotely challenged by the task, and standing in the middle of the wreckage, one arm visibly injured, held stiffly against his side, but otherwise entirely composed, is a man Ha-il has not seen in over 4 decades and genuinely believed was dead. An old friend, an old blade, the single most dangerous swordsman Ha-il has ever trained. "You look terrible," the man says, surveying Ha-il's bruised, exhausted state with open amusement. "For someone who apparently died and came back as a teenager, I expected better cardio." "You're supposed to be retired," Ha-il says, and for the first time since waking up in that rain-soaked playground, something in his chest, something he'd assumed had been trained out of him decades ago, loosens, just slightly, at the sight of a face he thought he'd never see again. "I was," the swordsman says. "Then I heard a rumor that someone matching your description walked into a hospital basement and started a fight he clearly couldn't finish alone." Behind him, Sua is already moving toward the elevator override, entirely unbothered by the small mountain of unconscious mercenaries at her feet. "We can catch up on the reunion later," she says. "Right now, I'd like everyone to focus on the part where we're still in a secret evil laboratory that's probably about to send reinforcements." She's not wrong. Somewhere above them, alarms are still sounding, and the Hollow Court's regional command structure, including a man named the Regent who has spent 3 weeks staring at increasingly unbelievable reports about a Falcon Division transfer student, is about to receive the single most alarming piece of intelligence of his career. Because when the facility's damage report finally reaches the Regent's desk that night, it contains a detail that makes him set down his tea, very slowly, and read the paragraph again to make sure he understood it correctly. Among the security footage recovered from the compromised laboratory is a partial, blurred image of the intruder responsible, and standing beside him, unmistakably, arm injured but composed, is a face the Regent has spent 30 years hoping he would never have to see again. A face belonging to a man who was, by all official Hollow Court records, executed for treason 4 decades ago. The Regent picks up his phone. "I need everything we have," he says quietly, "on the 12 founders, starting with the one they called the Spiral." The swordsman's name, the one Ha-il still uses for him, though he hasn't spoken it aloud in 40 years, is Tae-sang. Once, a lifetime ago, he was the second child ever raised inside the original orphanage, younger than Ha-il by 3 years, and infinitely more gifted with a blade than anyone born before or since. The court called him, in the records nobody outside senior leadership was ever supposed to read, the Spiral, a title earned for a sword technique he invented himself, one that turns a dozen individual strikes into a single, unbroken line of motion no ordinary fighter can read fast enough to counter. Officially, Tae-sang died 40 years ago, executed for treason after a mission that went catastrophically wrong. Unofficially, Ha-il was the one who staged that execution, faked the body, falsified the report, and spent one very long, very quiet night helping the only person he'd ever considered family disappear before the organization that raised them both decided he'd outlived his usefulness. "You never told me you were still keeping tabs on me," Ha-il says, as the three of them move quickly through the compromised facility's service corridors, Sua leading with quiet efficiency, Tae-sang favoring his injured arm but keeping pace regardless. "I run a noodle shop in a fishing village 3 hours from here," Tae-sang says. "You'd be amazed how many rumors travel through people who deliver fish for a living. Someone matching your old description showed up at Seishion Academy, and every instructor who watched you fight described a style nobody's used in 40 years. I put it together faster than I'd like to admit. And you just decided to walk back into court territory." "I decided," Tae-sang says, with the particular dry patience of a man who has clearly rehearsed this argument, that if the person who once told a terrified 15-year-old that family means showing up when it's inconvenient was suddenly back from the dead and getting himself killed in a secret evolution laboratory, I wasn't going to sit at home selling noodles about it. Ha-il doesn't have a response for that. He decides, privately, that he doesn't need one. They make it out through a service tunnel Sua locates via the facility's outdated blueprint archive, a route original enough that whoever built the lab's security perimeter clearly never expected anyone to know it existed. By the time regional Hollow Court reinforcements arrive at Seoyun General, sirens screaming, the three of them are already 3 blocks away, standing in an alley catching their breath, and Dr. Seo, still alive, still immobilized, still deeply unsettled by the entire experience, is being loaded into a medical transport by his own people, unable to explain to anyone how a Falcon Division transfer student diagnosed and exploited a physiological flaw in his evolution regimen that the gardener himself hadn't fully mapped. The fallout is immediate and, for Ha'il, deeply inconvenient. Within 24 hours, the Hollow Court's regional command has flagged Kang Ha'il as a person of interest requiring immediate re-verification, a bureaucratic phrase that, in practice, means every camera, every checkpoint, and every Falcon Division instructor in the building is now quietly, subtly watching him. Sergeant Beck, whose earlier hair-raising recognition Ha'il still hasn't accounted for, starts appearing in hallways he has no scheduling reason to be in. And Sua reports, via their usual encrypted channel, that her access to internal court networks has been temporarily suspended pending an unrelated routine security audit that started exactly 1 day after the Soyun General incident. They're not certain yet, she tells Ha'il, meeting him on the school rooftop after hours, the one place on campus without cameras, a gap in coverage Ha'il quietly ensured stayed unpatched 3 weeks ago, precisely for conversations like this one. If they were certain, you'd already be detained. But they're close enough that we don't have the luxury of moving slowly anymore. Then we stop moving slowly, Ha'il says. Tai-song, leaning against the rooftop railing with his injured arm now properly splinted, raises an eyebrow. That sounds like the beginning of a plan I'm not going to like. You're not wrong. The plan, once Ha'il lays it out, is exactly as reckless as Tai-song predicted, and exactly as necessary as Ha'il insists it is. The Regent, the man who seized control of the Hollow Court decades ago, who ordered the betrayal that killed Ha'il's original body, who has spent 30 years turning a church orphanage's twisted charity into a global killing machine, operates almost entirely from behind layers of intermediaries, never personally visible, never personally traceable. Attacking him directly, with the resources currently available, would be suicide. But the Regent has a weakness Ha'il intends to exploit ruthlessly: pride. 30 years of unchallenged power have made him complacent, certain that no threat inside his organization could possibly rival his control. A direct assassination attempt he'd anticipate and crush effortlessly. A quiet, patient dismantling of everything holding his empire together. That, Ha'il suspects, the Regent has never had to defend against, because nobody has ever survived long enough to attempt it. We're not going to kill him first, Ha'il says. We're going to make him watch everything he's built collapse, piece by piece, until he has nothing left to hide behind. And then we finish it. That's going to take months, Sua says. Maybe longer. I have time, Ha'il says. And there's something almost darkly funny in the observation, given that 3 weeks ago he had exactly 90 days left to live in an entirely different body. For the first time in a very long time, I actually have time. The first target is deliberate, symbolic, and, Ha'il privately admits, a little bit personal. The auction ship known throughout the criminal underworld as the Wraith, an unregistered, untraceable vessel the Hollow Court uses to launder its most valuable illegal transactions, from stolen weapons technology to something far darker that Ha'il refuses to think too hard about yet. It's also, according to Intelligence Chairman Zhang quietly provides through their private phone line, scheduled to host a 2-night auction event in international waters within the week, an event significant enough that senior court leadership, eager to demonstrate strength after the Soyun General embarrassment, plans to send one of its most feared active operatives to personally oversee security. Her name, whispered through the underworld with genuine dread, is the Blade Widow, a former assassin of a rival organization, the Kuroman Syndicate, absorbed into Hollow Court leadership after a hostile takeover years ago left her with nowhere else to go. She is, by every account Ha'il can gather, breathtakingly fast, disturbingly precise, and entirely without mercy. She is also, unbeknownst to Ha'il, guarding a secret considerably more dangerous than her reputation suggests. One that will, before the week is over, force him to confront exactly how far the Regent's manipulation has reached into the lives of people Ha'il is beginning, against every professional instinct he has left to care about. Chairman Zhang secures passage aboard the Wraith under the pretense of legitimate business interest, bringing Ha'il along as personal security, a cover so mundane it barely qualifies as a disguise, and exactly effective for that reason. Sua and the Choi brothers, over Ha-il's initial objection and Sua's very firm insistence, come along as additional coverage, disguised as cleaning staff, a role the brothers, predictably, both resent and are unexpectedly excellent at, charming half the ship's wealthy clientele within hours through sheer enthusiastic incompetence. Taesong stays behind, still recovering, tasked instead with a mission Ha-il considers equally critical, tracking down and warning any of the Hollow Court's other surviving original operatives, the remaining founders scattered and hidden across the world, whom Ha-il suspects the regent will move against the moment he realizes his organization's carefully maintained secrets are unraveling. The auction proceeds without incident for its first several hours. Priceless stolen art, dangerous chemical weapons technology, and increasingly disturbing lots that Ha-il catalogs with quiet, controlled fury for later use. Then the Blade Widow takes the stage to introduce what she calls the evening's true highlight, and Ha-il's entire plan nearly collapses under the weight of what he sees revealed inside the auction's centerpiece display case. Bound, restrained, and very clearly meant as bait rather than merchandise, is a man Ha-il recognizes instantly, despite the years and the visible damage. A former court operative he trained personally decades ago, one of the original 12, presented now as a trophy specifically calculated to draw out anyone still loyal enough to intervene. "Going once," the Blade Widow announces, scanning the crowd with the particular sharpness of someone who already suspects her real audience isn't bidding for profit. "Going twice!" Chairman Jang, exactly as Ha-il silently prayed he wouldn't have to, breaks the tension by placing an enormous, deliberately conspicuous bid, the only move available that doesn't blow Hale's cover entirely, and one that immediately, inevitably, draws the Blade Widow's full, suspicious attention directly onto their table. "Interesting," she says, gaze flicking toward Ha-il with the unhurried calculation of a predator who has just noticed something worth investigating. The chairman's bodyguard seems very invested in a lot he isn't bidding on. Ha-il understands, in that exact moment, that the quiet phase of his plan has just ended considerably earlier than intended, and that whatever happens for the rest of this night, there's no version of it that ends without a fight. "He's not invested," Chairman Jang says smoothly, before Ha-il can respond. "He's bored. I keep him around for security, not conversation, and frankly, the conversation on this ship has been considerably more interesting than the merchandise." "Sure, it's a good save. It's not good enough." The Blade Widow's eyes stay on Ha-il for one beat too long, the particular assessing stillness of someone who has spent her career learning to recognize threats before they announce themselves, and Ha-il, watching her watch him, understands with total clarity that whatever cover story Jang improvises, it's already starting to fray at the edges. "Security," she repeats, tasting the word like she doesn't quite believe it. "You have unusually still hands for a bodyguard. Most men in your position fidget when a woman stares at them for this long." "Most men in my position haven't met you before," Ha-il says. "I'm told the reputation is worse than the woman." Something flickers across her face. Not quite amusement, not quite offense, something closer to genuine surprise that anyone at this auction would speak to her so casually. For a moment, the tension almost breaks into something manageable. Then the restrained man in the display case, the operative Ha-il trained decades ago, weakened, exhausted, barely conscious, lifts his head, and his eyes land on Ha-il's face, and recognition hits him with enough force that he says, in a broken, disbelieving whisper that nonetheless carries across the entire silent auction hall, "Captain?" The single word detonates the room's careful, artificial calm instantly. Every operative embedded in the crowd, and Ha-il now realizes, with the sinking clarity of a plan unraveling in real time, that there are considerably more than he'd accounted for, turns toward their table simultaneously. The Blade Widow's expression shifts, in the space of a heartbeat, from curious to genuinely alarmed, because whatever rumor she's heard about a man matching Ha-il's old description apparently just became considerably harder to dismiss. "That's not possible," she says quietly, almost to herself. "A lot of things aren't supposed to be possible," Ha-il says, and stops pretending to be a bodyguard. "What follows is not, strictly speaking, a fight so much as a controlled demolition." Ha-il crosses the distance to the display case in under 2 seconds, shattering the restraint mechanism with a single precise strike before the nearest guard even finishes reaching for his weapon. Sua, abandoning her cleaning staff disguised the moment gunfire becomes inevitable, moves through the crowd with the fluid brutality of someone who has spent months training specifically for exactly this scenario, disarming 3 separate security personnel before most of the room registers she's moved at all. The Choi brothers, delighted beyond words to finally have an excuse to stop mopping floors, tear into the remaining guards with the enthusiasm of men who have been suppressing violence out of politeness for several hours and are thrilled to stop. The Blade Widow, to her credit, doesn't panic. She draws twin blades from a concealed harness with practiced speed and moves directly toward Ha-il, correctly identifying him as the only threat in the room who might actually challenge her. "I don't know who you used to be," she says, blades already crossing his guard in a blur of motion that would have ended most opponents in the first exchange. But the man they're all suddenly terrified of doesn't match anything in the court's official records. Which means either you're a very good imitation, or the court's been lying to itself for a very long time. "Little of both," Ha-il says, redirecting her second strike with the flat of his palm, feeling the impact all the way to his shoulder. She's fast, genuinely fast, faster than Crow, faster than anyone he's fought since waking up in this body. "I used to be someone your organization decided was more useful dead than alive. I'm working on convincing them otherwise." "Sentimental," she says, disengaging and circling. "Dangerous men usually are, underneath everything. It's the thing that gets them killed eventually." She's not wrong, and Ha-il knows it, and for several long, brutal exchanges the fight hangs in genuine balance. Her speed against his experience, her precision against his willingness to absorb damage in exchange for information about how she moves. It's the freed operative, still weak but conscious enough to recognize the pattern of a fight he's watched Ha-il win countless times before, who finally breaks the stalemate by shouting a single warning across the chaos. She favors her left side after the third exchange. Old injury, never fully healed. The Blade Widow's expression tightens with genuine fury at the betrayal, but the information lands before she can adjust for it, and Ha-il, testing the theory immediately, finds the old injury exactly where his former student described it. A subtle hitch in her left hip that costs her a fraction of a second on every 4th or 5th movement, invisible to anyone who hasn't spent decades learning to read exactly this kind of tell. The fight ends less than a minute later, not with her death. Ha-il has learned, painfully, the value of leaving certain opponents alive for what they know, but with both blades knocked from her hands and her own twin daggers crossed at her throat. Close enough to draw blood, not close enough to end anything. "Who ordered the retrieval mission that put him in that display case?" Ha-il asks quietly. The Blade Widow, breathing hard, staring up at him with an expression caught somewhere between fury and something almost like respect, doesn't answer immediately. When she finally does, her voice carries a bitterness that suggests the answer costs her something beyond simple loyalty. "The Regent doesn't give orders like that personally," she says. "He has someone who does it for him, someone who's been cleaning up his mistakes for 30 years and has started, recently, cleaning up mistakes the Regent doesn't even know exist yet. Name," Ha-il says. "You won't believe me. Try me," she tells him. And the name she gives, quiet, almost reluctant, delivered with the specific weight of someone revealing a secret that could get her killed twice over, is one Ha-il recognizes instantly, because it belongs to a man he personally trained, personally trusted, and personally believed died on a mission gone wrong exactly the same year Taesong was officially executed. Ha-il goes very still. "That's not possible," he says, echoing, without quite meaning to, the exact words the Blade Widow used about him minutes earlier. "A lot of things aren't supposed to be possible," she says, and for the first time all night, there's something that might almost be sympathy in her voice. They escape the Wraith before court reinforcements arrive, the freed operative barely conscious but stable, the auction's clientele scattering into the night with considerably more excitement than they paid for. Chairman Zhang, remarkably calm given the evening's events, arranges private transport back to the mainland without a single question about what he's just witnessed, a discretion Ha-il quietly, deeply appreciates. It's on the boat ride back, standing at the railing with Sua beside him and the freed operative resting below deck, that Ha-il finally allows himself to process what he's just learned. "You knew him," Sua says. "It isn't a question. I trained him," Ha-il says. "Decades ago. He was good. Genuinely good. One of the best I ever worked with. He died on a mission the regent sent him on personally, or that's what I was told at the time. I helped compile the report myself. I stood at what I believed was his memorial. And now he's apparently the person running half the regent's dirty operations. If the Blade Widow's telling the truth, do you think she is? Ha-eol is quiet for a long moment, watching the dark water pass beneath them, thinking about a young man he trained personally, trusted completely, and mourned genuinely, and about how many other pieces of his old life might turn out to be lies he simply never had reason to question. I think, he says finally, that I'm about to find out exactly how deep this organization's rot actually goes, and I don't think I'm going to like the answer. Behind them, unseen, on a private line routed through 3 separate countries to avoid any possibility of tracing, a report reaches the regent's desk describing, in careful, alarmed detail, the complete collapse of a mission that was supposed to demonstrate the Hollow Court's strength, and instead demonstrated, publicly and humiliatingly, exactly how vulnerable it's become. The regent reads the report twice. Then he sets it down, and for the first time in 30 years of running the organization he built from his father's ashes, he picks up a phone and makes a call he never expected to need to make. To a man everyone inside the court believes has been dead for years. A man whose survival, loyalty, and true allegiance are about to become the single most important variable in whether the regent's empire survives what's coming. He's found us, the regent says, without preamble, the moment the call connects. Faster than either of us expected. I need to know, after everything, after 30 years, are you still mine or are you still his? There's a long silence on the other end of the line. Then, finally, an answer that will determine the fate of everyone involved. The man on the other end of the line doesn't answer the regent's question directly. Instead, after a long silence, he says only, "Send me the coordinates. I'll handle it personally this time." The regent, satisfied enough by the evasion, because a man still loyal wouldn't need to weigh the question at all, and a man already lost wouldn't have answered the call in the first place, sends the coordinates and allows himself, for the first time in days, a moment of genuine relief. He is, as it turns out, wrong to feel relieved, but he won't understand exactly how wrong for several more days yet. His name, when Ha-il finally hears it spoken aloud again after 4 decades of believing it belonged to a dead man, is Jun-so, and the moment Sua manages to pull his old service file from a fragment of court archive she's slowly, patiently, been reconstructing access to over the past several weeks, Ha-il understands immediately why the regent trusts him enough to hand him the organization's most sensitive cleanup work. Jun-so was never actually killed on that mission decades ago. He was recruited, pulled aside personally by the regent in the immediate aftermath, offered a choice between a staged death and a permanent role as the regent's most invisible enforcer, and given, crucially, a reason compelling enough to accept, a younger sister, still alive somewhere inside the orphanage system, whose safety the regent made explicitly, quietly conditional on Jun-so's continued loyalty and silence. It's not forgiveness, reading that file, but it is, Ha-il admits privately, an explanation that makes considerably more sense than simple betrayal. If he's been running cleanup for the regent for 30 years, Sua says, scanning the last of the recovered file, he knows everything. Every hidden court asset, every remaining founder's location, every operation the regent's ever wanted buried. If we can turn him, we're not turning him, Ha-il says. Not with threats, and not with promises we can't actually keep. If he's spent 30 years protecting his sister by staying loyal, the only thing that changes his calculation is proof that staying loyal doesn't protect her anymore. That's a cold way to look at it. It's an honest way to look at it, Ha-il says. I'm done pretending kindness alone moves people like him. It doesn't. Certainty does. The plan that follows is the most delicate one Ha-il has assembled since waking up in his new body. Not a fight to win, but a truth to deliver, carefully, to a man who has spent 30 years convinced he had no choice but to become exactly what the regent needed him to be. They find Jun-so's sister first, not difficult, given Sua's growing fluency navigating the court's records, and given that the girl, now in her mid-20s, has been living for years under careful, distant court surveillance disguised as routine welfare checks, exactly the kind of quiet leverage an organization like the Hollow Court maintains as insurance against exactly the sort of loyalty crisis currently forming. Chairman Zhang once again proves invaluable. his resources sufficient to relocate the young woman quietly, thoroughly, and completely off any grid the court could reasonably access, within 48 hours and without a single traceable footprint. It's the single most expensive favor Ha-il has asked of him yet, and Jang authorizes it without hesitation. The debt from a hijacked train 40 years ago apparently still worth considerably more than money to the man who survived it. Only after the sister is genuinely, verifiably safe does Ha-il arrange to meet Junso directly, alone, unarmed, in a location neither the regent nor anyone else inside the court has any way of monitoring. Junso arrives exactly on schedule, exactly as controlled and unreadable as 30 years of enforced discipline would produce, and for a long moment the two men simply look at each other, teacher and student, separated by 4 decades and an entire lifetime of choices neither of them fully chose for themselves. "You look like a teenager," Junso says finally. "The regent's briefing didn't prepare me for how strange that would actually be to see in person." "You look exactly the same," Ha-il says. "That's the strange part for me." Junso doesn't smile, but something in his shoulders loosens fractionally. The particular, careful relaxation of a man who has spent decades never fully lowering his guard. Doing it now by a matter of degrees, testing whether it's safe. "I'm supposed to kill you," he says. "That's the assignment. The regent thinks I'm loyal enough to do it without hesitation." "Are you?" "I don't know anymore," Junso admits, and the honesty of it costs him something visible. "I used to be certain. Certainty was easier when I thought I understood what I was protecting and why." Ha-il doesn't answer immediately. Instead, he simply hands over a phone, already dialed, already connected, and watches Junso's face as a familiar voice. His sister's, safe, confused, but unmistakably alive and unmonitored for the first time in years, answers on the other end. Whatever certainty Junso had left dissolves entirely somewhere in the middle of that phone call. It takes him 3 days to make his final decision. 3 days during which he doesn't report Ha-il's location to the regent, doesn't complete his assigned mission, and doesn't, despite every instinct 30 years of conditioning has built into him, run. On the 4th day, he arrives at the safe house Suaz established, unarmed, unannounced, and hands over a single encrypted drive containing 30 years of accumulated intelligence. Every hidden court asset, every buried operation, every piece of leverage the regent has ever used to control the people beneath him. "This ends one of 2 ways, Junso says, setting the drive down carefully on the table between them. "Either you're strong enough to actually finish what you're planning, or the regent finds out what I've done and my sister spends the rest of her short life paying for my choice instead of me." "I'm not going to let that happen," Ha-il says. "You don't get to promise that," Junso says, quiet, tired, decades of accumulated caution finally cracking through the discipline. Nobody gets to promise that, not against him. Ha-il understands, hearing it, exactly how thoroughly 30 years under the regent's control has worn this man down, not into a monster, but into someone who has genuinely forgotten what certainty feels like. He doesn't argue the point further, he simply says, with the particular flat conviction of a man who has already decided something and is done debating it with himself, "I've spent 41 years being underestimated by people who assumed loyalty and fear were the same thing. The regent built an empire on that assumption. I'm about to spend whatever time I have left proving him wrong." With Junso's intelligence in hand, the picture assembles faster than any of them expected, and considerably worse than Ha-il feared. The regent's true operation extends far beyond a single hidden training school and an underground research laboratory. A sprawling network of shell corporations, compromised law enforcement contacts, and quietly blackmailed government officials spanning 3 countries, all of it built, patiently, over 30 years, on a foundation of manufactured killers and manufactured silence. At the absolute center of it, protected by layers of intermediaries so thorough that even Junso, 30 years inside the organization, has only met him in person twice, sits the regent himself, operating from a location so carefully hidden that even the drive's exhaustive intelligence can only narrow it down to a private estate somewhere along the eastern coastline, disguised, fittingly, as a rehabilitation retreat for troubled orphaned youth. "It's the original orphanage grounds," Taesong says quietly, studying the coordinates when he finally rejoins them, his splinted arm healing faster than any of them expected. He rebuilt it. After everything, after Father Gabriel, After all of it, he rebuilt the exact place where this whole thing started. That's not sentiment, Ha-il says. That's a man who genuinely believes he improved on something. He's not hiding from what he became. He's proud of it. The final piece falls into place 3 days later, when Jun-so, still working his official cleanup role to avoid raising suspicion, intercepts a communication confirming what Ha-il has suspected since the Wraith. The Regent, rattled by the accumulating failures, Crow, Dr. Seo, the Blade Widow, and now growing evidence that his most trusted enforcer's loyalty has quietly cracked, is calling an emergency gathering of every remaining senior court asset at the estate itself, in 4 days' time. It's meant to be a show of unified strength. A reminder, to an organization increasingly nervous about the ghosts circling them, that the Regent remains firmly, permanently in control. Ha-il, reading the intercepted communication, feels something settle into place that hasn't felt settled since he woke up in a stranger's body in the rain 3 months ago. 4 days, he says. That's not much time to plan an assault on a fortified estate housing every senior operative the court has left, Suwa says. We're not planning an assault, Ha-il says. We're planning an invitation. The plan Ha-il assembles over the following 4 days is, by his own private admission, the closest thing to reckless he's allowed himself since accepting a suicide mission at 22 that nobody expected him to survive. But reckless, he's learned across 4 decades, isn't the same as unplanned, and every hour of those 4 days goes into making sure the difference matters. The estate itself, once Jun-so's intelligence and Sua's reconstructed satellite access finish mapping it, turns out to be exactly as fortified as feared. 3 rings of perimeter security, a resident detachment of the Regent's most trusted senior operatives, and, at its center, a rebuilt chapel standing on the exact foundation of the original orphanage. The same ground where 12 stolen children were once raised into weapons, now serving as the throne room for the man who turned that theft into an empire. Frontal assault is suicide, Taesang says, studying the layout for the dozenth time. Even with everyone we've got. We're not doing a frontal assault, Ha-il says. We're doing exactly what the Regent spent 30 years training every operative under him to fear most. Which is losing control of the story, Ha-il says. He didn't build this empire on strength alone. He built it on certainty. Every operative beneath him believing resistance is pointless, that he's untouchable, that the organization's continued existence is inevitable. Jun-so cracked because his certainty cracked first. If we can do that to enough people inside that estate before a single shot is fired, the fight's already half won before it starts. The plan, once assembled, splits into 3 simultaneous movements. Taesang, alongside 2 of the surviving original founders he's spent the past weeks quietly locating and warning, will handle the estate's outer perimeter, not to conquer it, but to ensure nothing reinforces the center once the real confrontation begins. The Choi brothers, delighted beyond measure to finally receive an assignment matching their preferred combat style, will create enough visible, undeniable chaos at the estate's secondary security checkpoint to pull attention and resources away from the main approach. Suwa, working alongside Jun-so, will infiltrate the estate's internal communications hub and, at the precise moment Ha-il needs it most, broadcast Jun-so's accumulated 30 years of evidence. Every buried crime, every manufactured betrayal, every manipulated tragedy the Regent has orchestrated, directly to every operative gathered inside for the emergency assembly. And Ha-il himself will walk through the front gate, alone, exactly as the Regent's paranoid, rattled leadership half expects and fully underestimates. You're going to get yourself killed doing this. The theatrical way, Suwa says, the night before, watching him check equipment he barely needs. Probably, Ha-il agrees, but theatrical is the only version of this that actually works. If I sneak in quietly and kill him in his sleep, nothing changes. The organization survives, someone else takes his place, and everything he built keeps existing under a new name. I need every operative in that building to watch him lose. Publicly. Completely. That's the only ending that actually dismantles what he made. Suwa is quiet for a long moment. Then, with none of her usual sharpness, she says, "When you first told me who you really were, in that basement club, I thought I was talking to a madman who'd convinced himself he was someone he used to be. I don't think that anymore. What do you think now?" "I think," she says, You're the only person I've ever met who actually means it when he says he's going to fix something instead of just surviving it. Ha-il doesn't have a ready answer for that either. He's beginning to suspect, 4 decades into an unusually long life and 3 months into a strange, unearned second one, that he's simply not built for graceful responses to sincerity. He settles, instead, for putting a hand briefly on her shoulder, the closest thing to reassurance he knows how to offer, and says only, "Get everyone out safely." That's the part of this plan that actually matters to me. The gathering at the estate, on the appointed night, brings together every senior asset the Hollow Court has left. The Blade Widow, released weeks earlier after Ha-il chose, deliberately, not to kill her, arrives with an expression suggesting she still hasn't fully decided which side of this coming conflict she belongs on. A dozen other operatives Ha-il recognizes only from Junso's files fill the chapel's restored pews, waiting for the regent's address, with the particular tension of people who've all quietly heard the same unsettling rumors about a ghost circling their organization, and are hoping, without much confidence, that tonight's meeting will put those rumors to rest. The regent, standing at the chapel's altar, the same altar Ha-il knows from old memory, where Father Gabriel once granted 12 exhausted children their long-overdue retirement before his adopted son decided retirement was a luxury the organization couldn't afford, begins his address with practiced, commanding confidence. He doesn't finish it. The chapel's ancient wooden doors, reinforced decades ago against exactly this kind of intrusion and rendered irrelevant anyway, swing open under a single measured push, and every operative in the room turns to find a lone figure standing silhouetted in the entrance. Young, unarmed, utterly composed, exactly as unremarkable and exactly as impossible as the rumors have described him. "You've been looking for a ghost," Ha-il says, walking calmly down the center aisle, ignoring the dozen operatives already rising, weapons half drawn, uncertain whether attacking is the correct response to something none of them fully understand. "I thought it was time I introduced myself properly." The regent's expression, for the first time in 30 years of absolute control, cracks visibly. "That's not possible," he says. The same 3 words Ha-il has heard twice already this week, from 2 different people who believed, with total conviction, that the past they'd buried would stay buried. "You keep saying that," Ha-il says. "I'm starting to think the real problem isn't whether it's possible. It's that you've spent 30 years assuming the people you buried would stay buried quietly, the way you needed them to. I was never very good at staying quiet." At that exact moment, on cue, every screen in the chapel, installed decades ago for exactly the kind of controlled messaging the regent has always favored, flickers simultaneously to life, and Junso's 30 years of carefully documented evidence begins broadcasting to every operative in the room. The manufactured betrayals, the manipulated tragedies, the quiet blackmail used to control men and women who believed, until this exact moment, that their loyalty was a choice freely made, rather than a leash they'd never noticed tightening. The room's tension shifts, almost instantly, from confusion to something considerably more dangerous for the regent: genuine, collective doubt. "Turn that off," the regent orders, and for the first time, his voice carries something that isn't quite command anymore. It's closer to panic. Nobody moves to obey him. The regent doesn't panic for long. Whatever else 30 years of absolute power has cost him, it hasn't cost him the instincts of a man who was, once, one of Father Gabriel's own trained children. Never one of the original 12, never an apostle-tier operative, but raised in the same brutal system, taught the same brutal lessons, and apparently never quite as far removed from that training as he's spent 3 decades pretending. He moves first, and he moves fast. Faster than Ha-il's intelligence suggested a man in a leadership role for 30 years should still be capable of. Closing the distance to the altar's edge, and drawing, from beneath his robes, not a weapon exactly, but something worse. A small, unassuming remote, thumb already resting on a trigger. "You want to talk about ghosts," the regent says, breathing hard, every trace of composure finally, completely abandoned. "Let's talk about what happens to every single person in this room if I decide none of us walk out of here tonight." Behind him, hidden beneath the chapel's restored floorboards, something begins to hum, a low, mechanical sound that every operative present, trained from childhood to recognize danger in all its forms, identifies instantly and with real horror. "You wired the chapel," the the Blade Widow says, quiet, disbelieving. Your own people. Everyone you just called your family. I built a contingency, the regent snaps. Any competent leader would. I never expected to need it against my own operatives, but I'm not going to apologize for planning further ahead than the rest of you. Hyle, watching the man's hand tighten on the trigger, does the only thing 4 decades of experience has ever reliably taught him works in exactly this kind of moment. He doesn't hesitate, and he doesn't negotiate. He crosses the remaining distance to the altar in under a second, faster than the regent's thumb can complete its final motion, and the two men collide with a force that shatters the ancient wooden altar rail into splinters. The remote skitters across the floor, spinning, and for one suspended, terrible moment nobody in the chapel knows whether the trigger completed its signal before it left the regent's hand. It didn't. Barely. The hum beneath the floorboards stutters and dies, and the collective exhale that follows from a dozen hardened killers is audible even over the continuing broadcast of Junso's evidence still playing across every screen in the room. The regent, on the ground, bleeding from a cut along his temple, looks up at Hyle with an expression that has finally, completely abandoned any pretense of control. You don't understand what you're destroying, he says. This organization gave purpose to thousands of children nobody else wanted. My father built shelter for the abandoned. I built power for the abandoned. Do you know what the world does to unwanted children who don't have power? I do. I watched it happen to every single person in this room before I gave them a reason to matter. Your father tried to give them something better than power, Hyle says, quiet, and there's nothing performative left in his voice now. Nothing calculated. Just 4 decades of grief finally finding somewhere to land. He tried to give them a way out. You took that choice away from every single one of us the moment you decided our usefulness mattered more than our lives. I watched you do it to people I loved. I'm not interested in your justification anymore. Then finish it, the regent says, and for the first time, there's something almost like relief in his voice. 30 years of carrying an empire built on manufactured children, finally, terribly, willing to set the weight down. You clearly came here too. Hyle looks at him for a long moment. Around them, the chapel remains silent, every operative present watching, waiting, uncertain whether the next thing they witness will be an execution or something else entirely. No, Hyle says finally. I came here to take away the only thing you ever actually valued. Not your life, your control. He doesn't kill him. It costs him something to make that choice. 30 years of accumulated grief screaming for a simpler, more permanent resolution. But he's spent the last 4 decades learning exactly what kind of ending a body in a grave actually provides an organization built on myth and fear, and he refuses to hand the hollow court a martyr it can rebuild around. Instead, he ensures the regent lives long enough to watch, in real time, the empire he built collapse entirely without him at its center, every senior operative in that chapel choosing, one by one, in the hours that follow, to walk away from an organization whose foundation has just been publicly, undeniably exposed as manufactured cruelty rather than genuine purpose. The Blade Widow is the first to leave, pausing only to tell Hyle, with something that might be respect and might just be professional acknowledgement, that she doesn't expect to see him again, and hopes, sincerely, that she's right. Others follow in the hours after, scattering into a world most of them have never learned to navigate without an organization telling them where to point their violence. Some, Hyle knows, will find their way to something better. Others won't. It's not a clean ending. There's rarely such a thing, in his experience, when an empire this deeply rooted finally falls, but it's an honest one, and after everything, that feels like enough. The regent himself is handed over, eventually, to authorities in 3 separate countries simultaneously. Chairman Zhang's considerable influence ensuring the handoff happens quietly enough to avoid a media circus, publicly enough that no future version of the Hollow Court can simply reconstitute itself around him from a prison cell. Whatever sentence eventually catches up to him, Hyle decides, isn't really his concern anymore. He's spent his revenge on dismantling the man's power, not his freedom, and he finds, somewhat to his own surprise, that the distinction actually matters to him. Junso, reunited quietly with his sister for the first time in years, chooses, after everything, not to disappear entirely, but to stay close enough to help Suah and Taesung manage the slow, complicated work of untangling 30 years of the court's remaining infrastructure, buried assets, compromised officials, a scattered handful of operatives still uncertain what a life without the organization's structure even looks like. It's not going to be quick, he tells Ha-eul, the last time they speak before Ha-eul returns to Seoyeon Academy. 30 years of rot doesn't clean up in a season. I know, Ha-eul says. I'm not expecting it to. What are you expecting? Ha-eul considers the question longer than he expects to. I used to think the only thing worth doing with the life I had was making sure the people who wronged me paid for it, he says finally. I've had 3 months now in a body I never asked for, doing things I never planned on doing again. I think, for the first time since I was younger than you are now, I'm actually curious what happens next, instead of just certain about what has to happen next. Junso doesn't have a response for that either. He simply nods, the particular quiet nod of a man who understands, better than most, exactly how rare that kind of curiosity is for someone who came from where they both came from. Seoyeon Academy, when Ha-eul returns to it 3 days later, is exactly as ordinary as it was the morning he first walked through its gates. Students gossiping in hallways, teachers complaining about grading, the specific mundane chaos of an institution that has no idea it briefly sat atop one of the most dangerous secret organizations in the world and has since, quietly, been relieved of that particular distinction. Falcon Division still exists, technically, though its future is now considerably more uncertain than its past. Sergeant Beck, informed of everything in a private conversation Ha-eul still isn't entirely ready to discuss with anyone, has quietly begun steering the program towards something closer to what Father Gabriel originally intended: training, purpose, and genuine choice, rather than manufactured obligation. The Choi brothers, predictably, have already appointed themselves the division's unofficial senior mentors, loudly informing every incoming student that they personally helped take down an entire criminal empire, a claim that grows more elaborate every time Ha-eul overhears it repeated. Suah, walking beside him through the courtyard on an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon, watches a cluster of girls near the front gate whisper excitedly about the return of the school's most famous transfer student, and allows herself, for once, a genuinely amused smile. They still have no idea, she says. No idea what? That the boy they've spent months writing poetry about is old enough to be several of their grandfathers. I'd appreciate it, Ha-eul says, entirely deadpan, if that particular detail stayed between us. Wouldn't dream of ruining it, Suah says. It's genuinely the funniest thing I've ever been part of. They walk in comfortable silence for a while, past students who have no idea how close they came, weeks ago, to living in a considerably darker world than the one they woke up in this morning. Ha-eul finds himself, unexpectedly, enjoying the quiet, the particular, hard-won ordinariness of an afternoon with nothing urgent demanding his attention, nothing hunting him, nothing left to avenge. It doesn't last, of course. It never quite does, for a man with his history. That evening, alone in the small apartment Chairman Jang quietly arranged for him near campus, Ha-eul receives a message through the same encrypted channel Suah established months ago. A single photograph, time-stamped that morning, showing a familiar symbol burned into a wall in a city 3 countries away. A symbol Ha-eul hasn't seen in over 20 years, belonging to an organization he genuinely believed had been wiped out during his original service, back when he was still old enough to remember exactly how thoroughly that mission had gone. Attached to the photograph is a single line of text from Junso. You should probably see this. It's not over, it's just changing shape. Ha-eul looks at the photograph for a long moment. Then he sets the phone down, walks to the window, and looks out over a campus full of students who have no idea what walked among them for the past several months, or what might be coming next. He thinks about the daughter he never made peace with, about the bookstore he abandoned mid-lease, about a man who died in the rain 3 months ago and somehow, impossibly, got to keep living. He thinks, mostly, about the fact that for the first time in 4 decades, he isn't dreading whatever comes next. He's curious about it. Somewhere below, in the courtyard, a group of first-years are practicing sprints for tomorrow's morning drills, laughing about nothing in particular, entirely unaware of the storm that quietly passed through their school and left them safe on the other side of it. Ha-eul watches them for a while, and then, finally, allows himself something he hasn't earned the right to feel in a very long time. Peace. Temporary, probably. Fragile, certainly, but real, for now, and after everything, that's more than enough to start with. 3 weeks pass before Ha-yul finally acts on the photograph Jun-so sent him. He spends most of that time doing something he hasn't allowed himself in over 4 decades. Nothing urgent at all. He attends classes he doesn't need. He eats lunch on the school roof with Sua, who has taken to bringing exactly enough food for 2 without ever once acknowledging that she's started doing it deliberately. He watches the Choi brothers turn Falcon Division's dismantled training track into something almost resembling an actual after-school club, complete with a whiteboard schedule neither brother can agree on, and a supply closet Woo Jin has, against all logic, started using to grow tomatoes. It's the kind of ordinary Ha-il spent 41 years assuming he'd never be allowed to have. He finds he isn't in any hurry to give it up, even temporarily. But the photograph doesn't stop sitting in the back of his mind, and eventually, on a quiet evening after most of the campus has emptied out, he finds Taesong exactly where he expected, on the roof, sword resting across his knees, arm fully healed now, watching the sunset with the particular stillness of a man who spent 40 years pretending he didn't miss any of this. "You've been avoiding a conversation," Taesong says, without turning around. "I've been enjoying not having one," Ha-hul admits, settling beside him. "That's not the same as avoiding it forever." Ha-il shows him the photograph, the burned symbol, 3 countries away, a mark neither of them has seen since a mission decades ago that both of them assumed, at the time, had ended cleanly. Taesong studies it for a long moment, and something tightens visibly in his jaw. "The ashen hand," he says quietly. "I watched that organization burn to the ground personally. I stood in the wreckage." "So did I," Ha-il says. "Apparently we were wrong about how thorough that fire actually was. Or someone's using their old symbol to send a message they know we'll recognize," Taesong says. "Either possibility means the same thing for us, that it's not over." "That it's never actually over," Taesong corrects, with the tired, familiar patience of a man who learned that particular lesson considerably earlier in life than either of them would have preferred. Organizations like the Hollow Court don't die when you cut off the head. They just create a vacuum, and something always moves in to fill it. You know this better than anyone alive. Ha-il does know it. He's known it, if he's honest with himself, since the moment he watched the Regent's empire scatter into a dozen uncertain fragments rather than simply disappearing. Every operative who walked out of that chapel becoming, in some small way, a loose thread the world hadn't finished pulling on yet. "I'm not doing this alone this time," Ha-il says, "and it isn't quite a question, though it carries the shape of one." Taesong huffs something that might, in a more generous mood, be called a laugh. "You never actually asked me to come with you the first time either. I just showed up because you clearly needed the help and were too proud to admit it. I was dying of lung disease and being hunted by an entire criminal organization. I think proud undersells the situation slightly. You were still too proud to call me first," Taesong says. "Some things about you clearly survived the whole dying and coming back younger process completely intact." They sit together in comfortable silence for a while, watching the last light fade over a campus neither of them ever expected to feel any real attachment to. And Ha-il finds himself thinking, unexpectedly, of the bookstore he abandoned 3 months ago. The quiet, small penance he built for a version of himself who thought dying alone in a rented room was the closest thing to peace he'd ever earn. He doesn't miss the bookstore exactly, but he thinks, sitting here, that he understands now what he was actually building when he stocked those shelves and gave away books he couldn't afford to give away. Not a penance. A rehearsal for a version of his life where the violence wasn't the only thing that defined him. He's closer to that version now than he's ever been. Not finished. Probably never finished, given what he does for a living and what he's apparently still willing to do it for. But closer. Sua finds them both still on the roof an hour later, having correctly guessed, without needing to be told, exactly what kind of conversation 2 former killers having a quiet sunset together usually means. "New threat," she says, not a question. "New threat," Ha-il confirms. "Different continent, or are we lucky enough that it's local this time? Different continent. Old enemy apparently, wearing a symbol we both thought we buried." Sua sits down on Ha-il's other side, uninvited and entirely unbothered by that fact, and looks out at the same fading light the two of them have been watching for the past hour. "You know," she says, When I agreed to help you infiltrate a killer organization by pretending to be a low-rank trainee, I genuinely thought this would be a several-week project, tops. Kill some bad guys, expose an evil doctor, go back to my actual life. And now? Now my actual life apparently includes international incidents, she says. My brother keeps asking why I'm never home for dinner anymore. I told him I joined a very demanding study group. Does he believe you? Absolutely not. He's seen the news reports about an unregistered auction ship catching fire in international waters. He's not stupid, he's just polite enough not to ask directly. She glances sideways at Ha-yul. So, are we doing this? Or are you finally going to let yourself have an actual normal semester before the next crisis shows up? Ha-yul considers the question with more genuine weight than it probably deserves. He thinks about the empire he just spent months dismantling, about Jun-so quietly working to untangle 30 more years of buried rot, about Chairman Jiang's private phone line still sitting unused in his contacts, ready the moment he needs it. He thinks about a photograph of a burned symbol 3 countries away, and an organization he thought he'd already ended once, apparently very wrong about how permanent that ending actually was. Mostly, though, he thinks about the 2 people sitting beside him on this rooftop, neither of whom had any real reason to follow a dead man back into the fire, and both of whom did it anyway, without being asked twice. We finished the semester first, he says finally. Whatever's happening 3 countries over, it's not moving faster than a few more weeks. And I'd genuinely like to see whether Wu Jing's tomatoes survive the month. Taesung laughs. A real one this time. Warm and unguarded in a way Ha-yul hasn't heard from him since before either of them became what the world needed them to become. Listen to you. The most feared killer in 3 decades of court history, delaying an international incident to protect a supply closet garden. I contain multitudes, Ha-yul says, entirely deadpan, and for the first time in a very, very long life, he means it as something other than a grim joke. Below them, the campus lights flicker on one by one as evening settles fully over Soyeon Academy. Ordinary, unremarkable, blissfully unaware of everything that nearly happened beneath its surface, and everything that's still, quietly, waiting somewhere over the horizon. Ha-yul doesn't know yet what the Ashen Hand's return will cost him, or who else from his old life might resurface before this is finally, truly finished. He doesn't know how many more ghosts are still out there, waiting for a dead man's second chance to catch up with them. But for the first time since waking up in a stranger's young body in the pouring rain, he isn't facing any of it alone. And after 4 decades spent believing that was simply the price of what he was, that alone, more than the youth, more than the second chance, more than anything else this strange, undeserved second life has given him, feels like the real miracle.